Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Nadia Ansary. I'm a Rider University psychology professor, and I am an ISPU scholar. Thanks for joining us on ISPU's Wisdom Wednesdays, and I really appreciate that ISPU has invited me to speak to you for a half hour on the issue of religious-based bullying. And they've also asked me to share some of my personal experiences as a developmental psychologist. They've asked me to comment about why I do the research I do and to provide some advice to emerging scholars in psychology. Oh, that's all I can speak to as a psychologist. So I'm very privileged to speak to you for the half hour, and thank you for joining us on the Wisdom Wednesdays. Okay, so I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the nature of my work. I'm a developmental psychopathologist, and what that means is I'm interested in the intersection of developmental psychology with clinical psychology, or the study of how mental illness develops. So essentially, I'm interested in understanding how mental illness develops by conducting research about predictors of mental illness, both things that increase the likelihood that one will develop a mental illness, but also how we can learn about the things that protect one from developing a mental illness. Now, as a prevention science, developmental psychopathology is most interested in questions about how we can use the data to make evidence-based prevention programming. In other words, we want to have data-driven approaches to how we deal with these issues. So that's essentially developmental psychopathology in 3 seconds or less. My research interests are threefold. So first and foremost, I'm very interested in Muslim mental health. And then the second area that I'm most interested in is bullying prevention and intervention. And the third is the intersection of areas 1 and 2. So I'm very interested in the bullying of religious minorities, and in particular, Muslim American youth. So before I start talking about some data or some evidence about the issue of religious-based bullying, I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page when we talk about the word bullying. And I think that sometimes the word has taken on a different meaning. Some people use it rather loosely. And so I just want to make sure that we are on the same page, because aggression is one thing and bullying is an entirely different level of aggression. So let's talk about 3 things that are necessary for an instance or situation to be considered bullying. One is that there is a power imbalance, meaning that the person who's perpetrating the bullying is more powerful, either physically, socially, or in any other way, that they're more powerful than the individual who's the target of the bullying. So the first thing is we have a power imbalance. Part of that power imbalance is the second issue, which is that the person who is the target of the bullying is unable to defend him or herself. So the power imbalance, along with the individual being unable to defend him or herself, creates an abusive situation. The third part is that in order for a situation or set of situations to be considered bullying, is that there's a repetitive pattern, that the person who engages in the bullying is repeatedly abusing the person who's the target of the abuse. So these 3 elements are very important in understanding what bullying is and how we distinguish it from sort of more general ways of aggressing. And so because of that, because of those 3 elements, it's very important that we recognize that bullying requires very concerted and systematic efforts to address it. And it also requires that when kids are involved, that adult intervention happen. It necessarily must involve adult intervention. When people say, oh, it's kids will be kids, let them work it out on their own. When it's a situation of bullying, because of the inherent abusive and repetitive pattern of the interactions, intervention is absolutely essential. Okay, so that's sort of the framework that I'd like you to think about when we talk about bullying in this half hour together. Now on my slide, I have a couple of data points that I'd like to talk about. For religious minorities, the rates of bullying are quite high. Now, when we talk about Muslim, Jewish, Sikh, and Hindu American students, the rates of bullying range from roughly 30 to 67%. Now, that's a really wide range. But to contextualize that, it's important for you to recognize what the average, the sort of national average for non-religious minorities, right? So the national average is between 17 and 20%. Those levels are a little lower when we talk about cyberbullying, usually around 15 to 17%. So you can see the huge disparity between a nationally representative sample of American youth and this subset of religious minorities who are at an exceptionally high risk of being bullied, okay? So this is not just a Muslim American community issue. This is not just a Jewish American community issue, and same for the Sikh and Hindu communities. This is an issue of all minorities, not just religious, but all minorities are at an increased risk. And I'll also talk about some current trends that have affected or impacted those numbers. Now, many of you are interested in Muslim American students in particular. Now, ISPU has been at the forefront of looking at this issue, and especially so, well, for me as a researcher, it's very important that the nature of the work be of really high quality and very rigorous. And so I know when ISPU publishes something that I can rely on the quality and integrity of the data. So oftentimes in my presentations, I use these findings from ISPU's, I believe it's their 2017 report on Muslim Americans. In that report, they sampled nationally, they have a nationally representative sample of various religious minorities. And in the report, they tell us or found that 42% of Muslims reported that at least one of their children had been bullied in the past year. 42%, okay? Now, in 25% of those cases, a teacher or administrator at school perpetrated the bullying. Now, these numbers are both staggering and they're disturbing. And as a researcher who is invested on addressing bias and invested in addressing bullying, and particularly as anyone who is a part of the Muslim American community or an advocate for that community or an ally of that community, these numbers must mean that we have to do something to address it. ISPU asked me to talk about sort of my personal experience in choosing this type of research. And in conceptualizing how to convey that to you all today, I really thought about 3 reasons why I do the work I do. The first is that the research is necessary. The second is that I believe it's timely. And the third is that it's actionable. So let's sort of look at these 3 elements. Now, the research is absolutely necessary because of the high psychological cost associated with bullying, and in particular, the high psychological cost of religious-based bullying. Now, there's a couple of elements that we could parse out or disentangle here. One is that traditional bullying is associated with all sorts of negative psychological, academic, and social outcomes, okay? So in terms of psychological, we have, there's a lot of data to suggest that bullying is associated with low self-esteem, anxiety, depression, PTSD, as well as suicidal ideation and other forms of distress like externalizing behavior problems. So we have evidence about traditional bullying being associated with negative psychological outcomes. We also know that it affects children academically. It is associated with school disengagement, and we also know that in the social realm, there's evidence of disturbance in kids' ability to socialize, okay? When we look at cyberbullying, the psychological toll is even higher. There's something about the cyber context that is associated with higher levels of distress. Now, my recent article that I published a few months ago is a literature review talking about sort of comparing traditional bullying and cyberbullying and sort of doing a review on cyberbullying. And in doing that work, it became clear to me that the cyber context has a unique influence. Part of that is because of the anonymity that is afforded to us when we're online. The second is that the power imbalance is different online. And so what that means is a single incident that is occurring in the online context could be viewed by a multitude of people and can be retweeted, resent, resnapped, whatever, however you want to, whichever application you're using. That means that many people can be privy to one incident. So there's a lot of different reasons why cyberbullying may be associated with even more negative psychological consequences. But the research into bullying, traditional bullying, cyberbullying, is very important. And then I want to talk about bias-based bullying. Bias-based bullying, which is bullying because of someone's identity, right? Because I don't like to say because it assumes that that person's identity is the thing that provokes it, right? That they are somehow responsible for being targeted or being a target of the aggression. And that's not what I want to say at all. But attacks on one's identity are particularly problematic psychologically. And so we see very high rates of poor self-esteem, anxiety, depression, etc., for people who are attacked because of their identity. And that is in large part because that person, well, the idea of the psychological cost being so high probably comes from the fact that our identity is something very central to who we are. And so that will never go away. Of course, we don't want it to go away. But at the same time, it leaves us vulnerable to future incidents. So people who are a victim of bias-based bullying may fear future attacks because their identity doesn't change, okay? So going back to these 3 points, this is why I think the research is necessary. Let's talk about why the research is timely. The research is timely because there's a lot of research evidence to suggest there is a recent uptick in hate speech and hate crimes. So as of around 2015, leading up to the presidential elections, there was a ramp up in anti-Muslim hate speech, as well as hate crimes against Muslims. And so part of that has to do with the Muslim ban and the social and political rhetoric surrounding the ban, which then emboldened people and made it acceptable in some strange way to have Islamophobic sentiments and to communicate that. And so we've seen all sorts of research evidence in the last 5 years that support this recent increase in hate speech and hate crimes. Just to talk about a few of those data points, FBI hate crime statistics have shown Islamophobic hate crimes have increased. Pew Research Center, Gallup poll, Southern Poverty Law Center published a report on hate in schools and documented the increases in hate speech in schools. And then of course, ISPU has shown in their research on an annual basis in assessing their Islamophobia index, they have shown increases in Islamophobic sentiments across the years. So it's very clear that this is a vulnerable time for Muslim Americans. And we know this both from the research evidence as well as anecdotally. So to recap, the research is necessary because of the high psychological cost. The research is timely because of evidence suggesting a recent uptick in hate speech and hate crimes. But the most important of these is that the research is actionable. There is something that we can do with this research evidence. So as a prevention scientist, I think it's very important that we take the data that we have and formulate evidence-based strategies that are grounded in both the empirical literature, the research evidence, and the theoretical literature about Muslim mental health. Like, what do we know about the Muslim American community, and what insights do we have that can inform prevention efforts, but also looking at schools as systems and looking at the online environment in which hate speech can thrive. There's a lot of stakeholders in this pursuit of addressing bias-based bullying. So the research is actionable. I have several publications on addressing bullying in schools. And I think that there's a lot of great work that's being done in schools to promote a school culture that is inclusive, that promotes equity, and that values various identities in the school community. And I think through an emphasis on social emotional learning, by emphasizing curricula or implementing curricula that make sure that kids understand the value of kindness, respect, and that they are responsible for their own emotions and their own actions. When you have programs like that, then it makes bullying prevention and intervention work seamlessly within the school, because you have sort of a structure in place already for how we responsibly socialize and interact with one another. So in short, well, not very short, but in essence, I do this type of research because it's necessary, timely, and we can do something with it. Okay, so ISPU also asked me to talk about Muslim American youth in the school context. So related to bullying, but somewhat outside of it, what is the sort of experience or typical experience for Muslim American students? There's a lot of evidence to suggest that Muslim youth are marginalized and often live at the fringes of the school community. Now, I'm not saying that this is the case for every Muslim American student, but I am saying that the research evidence is showing a trend that many students report not feeling that they are a central part of their school community. So when we have marginalized groups, well, every school is different, but when a school recognizes that a group is marginalized within their community, efforts need to be made to bring those kids on the fringes more to the center of the community, by making them feel that they belong and that they are a valued part of the school community. In terms of my own research with Muslim American youth, I was really disheartened in conducting focus groups with some Muslim American youth, teenagers in particular. And I was disheartened by the sentiment or theme that kept coming up over and over and over again in our conversations, that many kids were afraid to self-identify as Muslims. In other words, they didn't easily share or felt comfortable sharing their Muslim identity. So what often happened, or what many kids reported, was, well, I don't really share it that easily, or I only share with my very close friends, or I only share when I don't feel vulnerable. And so this speaks volumes about how Muslim American youth feel about their identity. So for some, there is a fear of self-identifying, and this could be problematic in particular when misinformation about Islam is taught in social studies class or in other, when talking about current events or, media portrayals of Muslims. Oftentimes kids may feel compelled to correct that misinformation. And when they are compelled to do that, then they're also compelled to disclose their identity. And so this creates a situation where some Muslim kids feel uncomfortable but feel compelled to reveal who they are. And so, or in other times, like in social studies classes, for example, where teachers may not have a lot of information about Islam or may be misinformed about Islam, and ask the student to be the representative, for their group, for their religious group. And by sort of outing them or making it very apparent to their classmates, it can be challenging or a big responsibility for those kids. Another part of my research findings that I wanted to share with you about Muslim American student experiences is that roughly 50% of the kids in my sample reported worry over being bullied in the future. Now, to contextualize that, roughly 27 to 33% of the kids in my sample reported being bullied. And there's a range there because there were all different sorts of bullying outcomes that we measured. We measured being physically bullied, being called mean names, being socially ostracized, being cyberbullied, etc. So those values hovered around the high 20% to 33%, around there. But half of the sample, and this was a small sample, but half of the sample reported worrying about it. So they didn't necessarily have experiences of being bullied in the past, but they were very concerned that it would happen to them in the future. So I think that that is a very powerful statement about what Muslim American kids are concerned about. There are lots of struggles of Muslim children in the school context, and the research evidence is actually growing and quite abundant about these experiences. And so I've sort of crystallized them down into these 6 points. We just talked about the alienation from the school community. The second thing that I mentioned in a prior slide was misinformation about Islam. There is quite a lot of misinformation in our school's curricula. And so religious literacy is extremely important in combating misperceptions and tropes and stereotypes associated with Muslims. That misinformation is very deleterious. It's really has such a negative impact on Muslim American student experiences because it puts them in a very awkward position where they have to defend aspects of their faith. And oftentimes there's a power imbalance where the teacher is sort of seen as the authority figure and they may not have the correct information. And so it creates a very awkward and uncomfortable situation for many Muslim American students. Another thing to consider is social ostracism. Oftentimes these kids report, or at least in my own work, and this is supported by lots of research evidence, that Muslim American kids are not necessarily well accepted by their peers. They may not be the top choices to, among peers to socialize with. So social ostracism can be a very negative experience among Muslim children in the school context. The fourth point that I wanted to mention, so we've talked about bullying in sort of general terms. One of the major risk factors for religious-based bullying is the wearing of religious symbols. So among Muslim American females, the wearing of the headscarf or the hijab can be extremely risky. And I'm not advocating for people not to wear it. I'm simply saying that it can place individuals at risk. We see this with in the Jewish community, where individuals who wear the yarmulke or other signs of their faith. We see this within the Sikh community, where men wear the dastar or the turban as a symbol of their religious devotion. And those symbols can exacerbate or enhance or increase their risk for being targeted. Another thing to consider is this fifth point, that bullying often goes unaddressed or ignored by adults in the school when the target is Muslim. Now, this may seem like a very uh, uh, upsetting point. Why should Muslim American kids who report being bullied not have a just outcome to reporting it, right? We would expect that adults in schools would behave in ways that supported or at least protected every individual in the school context. Southern Poverty Law Center's Hate in Schools report mentions that among the religious minority groups, Muslims were the group for whom the school seemed to do the least amount when an allegation of bullying was made. In other words, for Muslim targets, schools often did not respond. And this is an important point for parents and for advocates to understand, that we have to ensure that schools investigate and implement their bullying intervention protocol, and to ensure that some kind of consequence is established for the child who bullies. And we also have situations in which adults at school engage in bullying. And so there's a lot of research evidence to suggest that we really need to have further professional development to address this issue. In the few minutes that are remaining, I just want to talk about online hate speech. It's extremely, extremely dangerous. There are far right-wing groups that are engaging in this. There are lone wolves, people who are not affiliated to any one group, who are engaging in this. The problem with online hate speech is that what is happening in the online context creates a lot of momentum for what can happen face-to-face. So it informs and fuels the conduct that happens offline or in our environment, in our interactions. So online hate speech really needs, we need to take it very seriously and work as a community to address it. Again, the data are very clear about issues surrounding Islamophobic cyberbullying. It's associated with anxiety, depression, as well as isolation, among many other psychological outcomes. COVID-19, sheltering in place, and the sort of major shift of all of our school work and social pursuits are all shifted online. And so this has created sort of a bit of clearly a distress and disruption for many of us. It's created an opportunity for people who want to engage in Islamophobic hate speech to do so in ways that really can be very impactful, that can really harm. Zoom bombing, we've heard anecdotal evidence of Zoom bombing for lots of different religious minorities, as well as racial and ethnic minorities. These types of incidents serve to dehumanize, to stereotype and promote exclusion of minority groups in society. And essentially, the point I want to make about this is that people who are engaging in the online Islamophobic hate speech right now are really capitalizing on a very vulnerable time for all of us. Clearly, the coronavirus sheltering in place has increased our collective stress and anxiety. And so when Zoom bombing happens, it opportunistically takes advantage of this set of circumstances. And it creates an even more challenging time for minorities. So in closing, ISPU has asked me to share some of my recent accomplishments and some upcoming events. As I mentioned to you, I recently published a cyberbullying review of the literature. I think Kat will be sharing that through ISPU's through our chat and maybe in other ways. I also wanted to talk about a keynote presentation that I conducted in October of 2019 with the International Bullying Prevention Association. They had an interfaith anti-bullying summit, and I was the keynote presenter there, and they've asked me to return to give the similar presentation at 3 upcoming events around the US. Of course, that is now on hold, but I'm looking forward to the day when I can do that again. And the last thing, I've been working with a very close colleague of mine to evaluate anti-bias teacher training effectiveness. As a prevention researcher, it's very important, or I feel it's very important, that we have to make sure that our prevention and intervention efforts are effective. And if we can identify gaps through data, then we can improve our training effectiveness. Okay, so advice for emerging scholars. It's a marathon, not a race. So it's very important early on to find a good work-life balance. The second thing I want to say for people who are starting out in careers in academia or in research, it's important to have confidence in yourself, to follow your gut when it comes to important decision-making in your career. The last thing I want to talk about is the peer review process. Unfortunately, some reviewers mistake being critical for being mean-spirited, condescending, or obnoxious. And so what I want to say to emerging scholars is develop a thick skin. Then, without being defensive, when you get a review that may be scathing, put it away and take some time, consider their critiques, revise your work, and then resubmit it. And if you have to resubmit it elsewhere, then that's fine. So those are my 3 points for emerging scholars. I want to thank you for sharing your a half hour with me today. I'm Dr. Nadia Ansary. There's my email, and you can check out my website at nadiaansaryphd.com. Thank you so much for your time.